Next, we explore what is a high-quality defect report. Each organization may have their own guidelines on how to report defects and what would be a high-quality defect report in a particular organization. There are also academic studies looking at what is a high-quality defect report. Two papers from roughly 10 years ago investigated this by asking software developers what is a high-quality defect report and what information does it contain. So the way this was carried out is that the survey form was sent to software developers asking on which of the information was considered useful for when fixing bugs. And the software developers could select from the list of information, and then in the next phase they would rank the usefulness of these different pieces of information based on their own work. So this was the approach taken on both studies. The study that is here on the lower, what makes a good bug report, was done first, and then the above study was replication of that lower study. So they both investigated the same thing. In the first study, in the lower one, there was 130 valid responses from software developers. They came from open source organizations, Apache, Eclipse, and Mozilla. And in the later survey, there were 74 responses, and they came from 5 anonymous software companies that developed closed source software projects. The bottom line of the survey is largely the same. So in both surveys, there was an agreement that steps to reproduce a defect is the most important information that defect report can contain. But in a way, steps to reproduce is kind of like a catch-all type of defect report where you must report everything. So these different components of defect reports are not at the same size. So obviously the steps to reproduce is the number one, because it enables the developer to reproduce the defect and therefore to make the fix. So beyond steps to reproduce, there were some differences. For example, in the first survey, stack traces was the second most requested information, whereas in the later survey it was only in the 9th place. And looking the other way around, in the second survey, the second most important information requested were screenshots, which was on the 5th place on the first survey. In the first survey, what makes a good bug report, test cases was ranked as the 3rd most important information, whereas in the second survey it was only ranked 17th. So this was already closer to the bottom. In the later survey, part of the application where the defect exists was the 3rd most important information for fixing defects. But in the first survey, this was not asked at all. So there is no information about that in the first survey. We can think that the difference is, for example, what is the second most important information? Is it stack traces or is it screenshot? Depends on the type of software that they are running. If the software is very visual, has a lot of different screens, then the screenshot might be higher ranked, whereas if the software is, it has a less graphical user interface elements, then the software developers will be more keen to see stack traces, which show the internals of the software. Okay, let's look into the data of the second survey to see what is in there. So here is the results from the second survey in a way, in an Excel, so that it's a bit easier to handle. So the first, they could select whether information is useful in fixing a defect in a first place. So let's see what is the most useful thing by sorting from largest to smallest. Okay, so we can see the top 3 would be steps to reproduce. 97% of the respondents selected this to be useful. Screenshots selected by 95%. part of the application selected by 92%. On the fourth place, there would be the operating data, user files, data models, databases, selected by 82%. Fifth place, configuration of the application. For example, what options are set in the preferences. Then if we go to the bottom, we can see that in the lowest rank, selected only by 34%, is the hardware context. So is it Mac, PC, mobile, or what else? Test cases, test scripts, 47%. Severity of the bug, how serious is this bug? So the software dev was only selected by 54%. Although this is important information in the sense that the severity of the bug is used to determine whether such a bug is fixed, but we asked whether this information is useful for fixing a defect. So the software developers do not consider it to be very important. I think the result might be different if we would ask software project managers on whether this information is important or not. Another way to look at it is that after the software developers that responded, after they have selected a particular information, then they would rate its usefulness on fixing the defect. So we have columns slightly useful, fairly useful, quite useful, and very useful. Now we can sort by the very useful field, and it should provide the same kind of result as the selected field. Okay, if we look into what got very useful, okay, so 90% select that steps to reproduce is very useful. On the second place, we have part of the application with 66% considering to be very useful, and it was selected by 92%. But on the third place, we have the observed behavior, which is considered useful by 60%, but it was only selected by 77%. So clearly there is some difference here. So when fixing the defect, it's actually considered by very useful by the people that selected. If we look into the bottom, we can see a similar pattern as in the selected. So the column that has very useful selected by the lowest percentage is the severity of the bug, which was also very low on the selected thing. We have software context, not very useful for fixing of the bug, or only considered useful by 7%. So the software context would be operating system, user application, and so on. And then we have the hardware context and the bug title. So this is on the usefulness of information when fixing a bug. But there is obviously another dimension as well. And this other dimension is whether this information is missing or incorrect. So we can formulate a chart of the usefulness of the information versus how often is the information missing or incorrect. And why this is important is that, well, if information is useful, but in defect reports it's always present, it's always correct, then there is really no problem. But if the information is useful and is often missing or incorrect, then there is a problem. So in the figure we can see the previously listed defect items, and on the x-axis we have the percentage of very useful for fixing defect ratings. So here from 0 to 100 is basically the same data that we just looked into the Excel. But here is also the y-axis, which is the percentage of quite often missing or incorrect ratings. And if we consider this figure, the most problematic defect information would be one found on the top right corner, because it would be very useful for fixing defects and it would be quite often missing or having incorrect information. And now if we start to look from coming down from the top top right, we can see that steps reproduce, very useful, and 50% consider that this is quite often missing or incorrect. So the same story here. Steps to reproduce, very useful, but not so often correct as the software developers would like it to be. If we look in here, we can see that stuff that is often incorrect or missing, hardware and software context. This is quite high, these bubbles here, but it's not considered very useful for fixing a defect, so it's not really a problem. On the other hand, we can see that screenshots is considered quite useful, and it's also missing or incorrect quite often. The same with stack traces. Very useful, rating is high, but also often missing. Same for expected behavior. Part of the application, which was considered very useful for fixing defect, is correct in most cases. Operating data is sort of in the middle, quite useful for fixing defects, and also quite often missing. Then the information that's not really a problem is bug title, not very useful, and it's nearly always there. Reporter's contact information, not so useful, always present. Severity of the bug, well, not useful at all, and quite often also reported correctly.